Pack your bags and get out of my sight. This family is done carrying your useless weight, Victoria. My stepmother, Victoria, screamed those words straight into my face in the middle of our family mansion's mahogany-paneled living room. Beside her, my stepbrother, Harrison, smirked, carelessly swirling a glass of my late father's 20-year-old scotch. Around us stood 6 high-powered estate attorneys, 3 family friends, and a room full of grieving guests. My father's heart had stopped beating less than 5 hours ago. His body was barely cold in the mortuary, yet Victoria was already orchestrating my complete destruction in front of everyone we knew. She took my father's gold signet ring from her pocket, tossed it at my feet, and sneered, "You're nothing now. A penniless orphan." The room was deathly silent. People lowered their heads, averting their eyes, and nobody stood up for me. That was their first mistake. I didn't cry, and I didn't raise my voice. I simply knelt down, picked up my father's ring, wiped off the dust, and placed it on my pinky finger. "Fine," I said softly, looking Victoria dead in the eye. "I'll leave." But that is not where this story began. 3 months earlier, that exact moment would have seemed entirely impossible to anyone who knew our family on the outside. 3 years earlier, my life had looked vastly different. When my biological mother passed away, my father married Victoria, a woman whose superficial charm hid a calculating, cold ambition. She came packaged with Harrison, an arrogant trust fund parasite who had never worked an honest day in his life. Almost overnight, Victoria took control of my father's daily routine, quietly isolating him from his legitimate business partners and slowly whispering poison about me into his ear. To the outside world, I was just Clara, the quiet, plain-spoken daughter who worked in low-level corporate compliance. Victoria made sure everyone viewed me as weak, dull, and entirely dependent on the family fortune. At family dinners, she would openly mock my modest wardrobe. At charity galas, she would introduce Harrison as the future titan of the family dynasty, while referring to me as her husband's quiet, unproductive dependent. When I started taking frequent weekend trips to Manhattan, Victoria openly laughed at me across the breakfast table, asking if I was running off to do little clerk work in the big city, and warning me not to embarrass the family name. I didn't argue with her, and I didn't correct her. I let her believe I was struggling, and I let Harrison think he was an untouchable genius. Gaslighting me became their favorite pastime, but through every insult and deliberate slight, I remained entirely calm. I knew reacting would give them power, and I knew that keeping my head down was the ultimate armor. Remember that detail. It matters later. As my father's health began to decline over the following 2 years, Victoria's cruelty amplified beyond petty insults. She took advantage of my father's failing mind as early-onset dementia set in, manipulating him into signing over the voting rights of his real estate firm to Harrison. Harrison immediately began abusing his newfound authority in the most grotesque ways possible. He flexed his unearned power at every turn, belittling the firm's longtime employees, firing anyone who questioned his gross incompetence, and surreptitiously embezzling funds to fuel his lavish lifestyle of private jets and high-stakes gambling. One evening, after I questioned a suspicious $400,000 corporate expense on my father's books during a rare visit to the office, Harrison caught me in the grand hallway of the estate. He pushed me hard against the paneled wall, his breath heavy with expensive alcohol, and whispered with venom in his voice that I was a pathetic little leech. He swore that when the old man kicked it, he was going to liquidate everything and make sure I didn't see a single dime. He leaned in closer, smirking as he promised that I'd be begging on the streets and that he'd personally make sure no firm in the city ever hired me. I simply adjusted my jacket, looked him dead in the eye, and asked if that was all he had to say. He scoffed and walked away, convinced that my composure was nothing more than cowed cowardice. They had no idea what was coming. What Victoria and Harrison never bothered to learn was what I actually did on those quiet weekend trips to Manhattan. 6 years ago, long before my father fell ill and long before Victoria came into our lives, I had quietly founded a covert commercial real estate investment entity called Vanguard Apex. I started small, leveraging my own independent savings from early investments and partnering with anonymous institutional backers who valued absolute discretion above all else. While Harrison was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars of my father's money on luxury yachts and designer watches, I was negotiating multi-million-dollar land acquisitions across the Northeast. 18 months ago, I closed the biggest deal of my entire career, the full buyout of a landmark, 52-story commercial skyscraper right in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. Alongside that massive acquisition came a structured tech portfolio liquidation that netted me a personal, unencumbered windfall of $28 million. I kept every single cent under an airtight private trust managed through a top-tier legal team in New York. Not even my father knew the full scale of my independent fortune. I deliberately let Victoria and Harrison believe I was broke and defenseless, biding my time, waiting for the day they would inevitably push their greed too far and reveal their true colors. 2 months before my father's death, Harrison made a desperate, catastrophic play that set his own trap into motion. He took out a high-risk $15 million bridge loan against the family's primary commercial property, the flagship building in downtown Manhattan where my father's life's work had been headquartered for 3 decades. Harrison thought he was a brilliant real estate mogul and foolishly assumed the market would soar enough to cover his reckless speculation. Instead, the market turned, and the lender quickly sold the underlying debt note to an aggressive holding firm. Harrison was so blindingly arrogant that he didn't realize he had signed a personal guarantee backed by predatory default clauses. He was suddenly bleeding money, drowning in astronomical interest payments, and terrified of being exposed. To cover his tracks, he and Victoria manipulated my dying father into signing a revised, forged codicil to his will, leaving the entire family estate, the primary company shares, and the family mansion exclusively to Victoria and Harrison, effectively cutting me out entirely. I knew about the forged document the exact day it was executed, because my internal contact at the law firm leaked the paper trail to me immediately. I could have stopped them right then, and I could have called the police or filed an emergency injunction. But the worst part was still ahead. I wanted them to feel entirely invincible before the spring slammed shut. That brings us back to the afternoon my father took his last breath. He passed away at 2 in the afternoon, and by 4 that same day, while his body was still being removed from the estate by the coroners, Victoria had already summoned the family's legal team and primary creditors to the main hall. She wanted to execute the revised will immediately and throw me out on the street while the shock was fresh and raw. She declared in front of everyone that I had 30 minutes to clear my things out of the guest room because the house belonged to Harrison now, and that my father had left me nothing, not a cent, and not a brick. Harrison had smirked, tossing my father's signet ring at my feet like trash, telling me to take my belongings and walk, because security was waiting to escort me off the driveway. They thought this was their ultimate glorious triumph, and they believed they had finally broken my spirit. This is where everything changed. I slid my father's signet ring onto my pinky finger, took a slow, measured breath, and turned to face the stunned audience in the living room. I told Victoria calmly that she was right about one thing. My father's firm was indeed entirely broke, but only because Harrison had defaulted on the $15 million bridge loan the previous Tuesday. Harrison's smug expression froze in an instant, and he demanded to know how I could possibly know about that confidential debt. I pulled a thick stack of blue-bound legal documents out of my leather briefcase and explained that the offshore holding firm that had bought out his defaulted debt note wasn't offshore at all, but rather a subsidiary of Vanguard Apex Holdings. A low, nervous murmur rippled through the gathered attorneys as Victoria snapped, asking what Vanguard Apex was. I looked directly at the lead family attorney, Mr. Vance, whose face was rapidly draining of all color as he scanned the top document in my hand. I informed the room that as the managing sole member of Vanguard Apex, I had executed full debt-for-equity foreclosures on all primary assets tied to my father's estate at 8 that morning, which meant I now officially owned the mansion, the corporate headquarters downtown, and every single asset Harrison had foolishly put up as collateral. Harrison stammered in horror, asking if I owned the debt, but I corrected him softly, telling him I didn't just own the debt. I owned the underlying land, the buildings, and the deed to the 52-story flagship tower on Fifth Avenue, where his firm owed 3 years of back lease payments. I set the documents down on the central oak table with a firm thud and mentioned, in a perfectly conversational tone, that my personal liquid valuation stood at $28 million. I told them I didn't need a single penny from my father's compromised estate, but that Harrison and Victoria now owed my holding company $17.2 million, due in full by 5 that afternoon. The room descended into utter paralysis as pens dropped to the floor and gasps echoed off the high ceilings. Victoria shrieked that this was impossible and that I was just a low-level clerk. But I looked at her with total calm and reminded her that an arrogant enemy will always destroy themselves if you just give them enough room. Before she could process the shock, two uniformed officers and federal fraud investigators stepped into the foyer with a warrant for Harrison's arrest regarding wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the forged alteration of estate documents. Harrison broke down into hysterical tears as the steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists, begging his mother to help him as the officers dragged him out the grand front entrance in full view of every prominent figure in the city. Victoria turned back to me, her eyes wild with terror, and fell to her knees, grabbing the hem of my coat to sob that we were family and to beg me not to take her house away. I gently pulled my coat from her frantic grip, looked down at her with unbroken composure, and repeated her exact words from earlier, telling her to pack her bags and get out of my sight because security was waiting to escort her off the driveway. An hour later, the mansion was completely silent. The lawyers had fled, and Victoria was left standing at the end of the long, rain-slicked driveway with two suitcases, waiting for a ride that was never coming. 6 months later, Harrison was sentenced to 8 years in a state penitentiary, while Victoria was forced into a tiny basement apartment on minimum wage to satisfy her civil judgments. I took over my father's legacy, restored the company to ethical profitability, and moved my primary office to the top floor of my Manhattan skyscraper, a daily reminder that silence, patience, and quiet strategy will always triumph over arrogant noise. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with? Tell me your story in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more revenge stories every week.